Senator for Victoria, James Paterson. Thanks for joining us, James. You called for this inquiry. We'll come to that in just a moment. But first up, on the pandemic, extra funding boost into aged care today, announced by your Health Minister, Greg Hunt, along with the Aged Care Minister, Richard Colbeck. But clearly, the federal government should have been doing a lot more in this area. It was clear as early as February that the aged care sector was going to be the most vulnerable spot for this pandemic.
Chris, the Minister and the government absolutely accept that lessons have been learned in the handling of aged care, and we can always do more, and we will do more because we take our responsibilities very seriously. But it would be remiss of me not to point out that the federal government regulates and funds aged care in every state and territory in Australia, and it is only in Victoria that we have a serious outbreak in aged care in Victoria. So while we accept our share of responsibility, the Victorian government needs to share its fair share of responsibility as well.
Well, let's move on to China. Why are you so concerned about what's happening in universities? We've seen reporting from Shari Marks and Kyla Lusukian in The Australian pointing out that a lot of our academics, dozens of them in fact, have been doing deals where in fact they're sharing some of their research with China, sometimes unbeknownst to their own university.
Chris, I think Shari's reporting in The Australian was in many ways the straw that broke the camel's back. There'd been a lot of concern raised for many years now about our university's relationships with China, whether that's the Drew Pavlou matter at the University of Queensland, more recently the Elaine Pearson matter at the University of New South Wales, or last year when Monash University entered into a relationship with COMAC, which is a state-owned firm in China in the aerospace industry. It's been credibly accused of industrial espionage, and it has technology which could easily have dual-use purposes, both civilian and military purposes. So when we learned last week via Shari's reporting that universities had been entering into these 1,000 talents arrangements, and indeed some of their academics had been entering into those arrangements unbeknownst to their universities, or at least some details unbeknownst to their universities, that was the final straw for me and I think a lot of other parliamentarians. That was very clear to me then that light needs to be shed on this, that the lid needs to be lifted to find out exactly what is going on, because I don't think universities have managed these risks prudently.
Gee, they know what they're doing, don't they, the Chinese, using our universities in this way, cultivating those relationships. Now, the federal government is asserting its constitutional authority when it comes to foreign affairs with this new foreign relations bill that will make sure state governments, like Victoria signing up to Belt and Road, can't just go off and do that unless they get federal approval, which is sensible enough. Now, obviously, Victoria's deal could get scrapped here. Bill Shorten, I think very wisely, is saying, I shouldn't say Bill Shorten, I'm one leader back. Anthony Albanese, no doubt with Bill Shorten's approval, has very wisely suggested that another deal that should be looked at under these arrangements is the 99-year lease of the Port of Darwin, because in current situation, you'd hardly think the federal government would approve that. It didn't know enough about it at the time. Do you agree that that should be revisited, revised under this legislation?
Chris, I've said a number of times publicly that I believe that the lease of the Port of Darwin to a state-linked enterprise in this instance was a mistake, and that I'm pleased that significant changes have been made to our foreign investment framework to ensure that if a deal like that was proposed today, I think the chances of it being approved are, if not zero, very, very close to zero. And
absolutely, but should it be revisited under this legislation with a chance of maybe scrapping the deal, or would that do too much damage to sovereign risk in this country?
I think the sovereign risk is a real risk, and we should be think very carefully about that. If a deal was made under the law of the land at the day and money was exchanged, then the only way that that contract could be extinguished under our federal constitution, which requires that extinguishment of property occur on just terms, is that people be quite handsomely compensated for that loss. So we'd have to very carefully consider that, and whether the signal that would send about foreign investment would be a worthwhile one. But the real target of the arrangements announced last week were arrangements between state, territory governments, local governments and universities.
Sure. Sorry to cut you off.
Rather than commercial transactions.
Yeah, understood. But to summarise, though, what Anthony Albanese is proposing regarding the Port of Darwin, do you support what he's doing? Do you think he's onto a reasonable idea?
Well, I'm not sure he's sincerely proposing that, Chris. I think he's just using it as a device to attack the government, when actually this government's done more than any other to really robustly defend Australia's sovereignty and national interest and values. And I think we've come a long way in Australia since the Port of Darwin lease was allowed, and I'm glad that we have.
Thanks for joining us, Senator.
Thanks, Chris.